Okay, let's get started. First of all, I want to welcome you to this final round. Let's give these young people a round of applause here. This is a big deal. This is the first year that the Indiana High School Forensics Association has included this event, World Schools Debate. It's been around for a while on the international scene. It was provided at the National Speech and Debate Association tournament last year in Dallas, and so we're very pleased to add this event to our schedule. Let me begin by introducing the proposition team. If you would stand when I announce your name. Sarah Frisbee. Olivia Jacobs. Noah Alderton. Matt Picard. And Zane Judd. And the opposition team, Elizabeth Carrier. Katie Lehman. Calvin Duke. Abraham Hawk. And Christian Huntington. And judges, if you would please wave to our competitors up here so they can see where you are. We have Austin Summers, Tony Creville, Fred Shears, Jessica Hilbrick, and Linda Arney. Let's hear a round of applause for our judges. The topic of this final round. This was an impromptu round. They did not find out this topic until 1 hour ago. They had 1 hour to prepare for this round. They were not able to use any computer or internet technology. They could only use 2 general reference books, such as a dictionary, almanac, atlas, etc., and their brains. So let's see what these young people can do with this topic today. And it is, the House believes that it is better for a leader to be feared than loved. And now for our final World Schools Debate.
My friends are. Yes. My other friends are. Yes. My judges are. And I shall begin. Darth Vader. One of the most iconic characters of the late 1970s and early 80s. But before he was Darth Vader, he was first a beloved Jedi, Anakin Skywalker. And in fact, he was loved and revered by his fellow Jedi Council, and thusly was treated with much veneration and respect. But then we all know in Episode 3, he turned to the dark side. And one of the main proverbs of the Star Wars film collection is, anger leads to hate, hate leads to fear, and fear leads to the dark side. But if you think about it, all of the Sith Lords and dark side members had the coolest powers. They could force choke, they could shoot lightning out of their hands, and honestly, they're the most powerful. And this representation of Star Wars really relates to our House motion, which states, this House believes that it is better for a leader to be feared than loved. I am your first speaker for Team Proposition, and in this speech I'll be defining a few key terms, placing a burden on Team Opposition, as well as defining our first 3 contentions and then elaborating on 2. Before I begin our contentions, I'd like to define a few key terms. First, we'd like to define leader as a person who has control over his scope of power. We'd like to define fear as a concern for well-being, but also used with reverence. And we'd like to define love as intense admiration. Now, and we'd also like to place a burden on Team Opposition to prove that they must show that love is more powerful for a leader than fear. Now on to our contentions. Our first contention is that many great leaders in our past history have been feared. Our second contention is that love oftentimes leads to irrational decisions. And our third contention is that fear oftentimes leads to positive change. As your first speaker, I'll be talking about our first 2 contentions, and our second speaker will be elaborating on the third. Now to our contentions. Our first contention is that many great leaders in our past have been feared. A key example of this is one of our presidents, who's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, if you don't know, before he was president of the United States, he first led the Allied forces in World War II, and he was very feared and respected by not only the Nazis, but also the colonial Japan leaders. And after his success in World War II, he was quickly elected president. But he also had polio and was thusly placed in a wheelchair. And according to FDR, he did not want to be seen in the public in a wheelchair because he believed that it would show pity, and they would pity him for being in this wheelchair. And pity oftentimes leads to love and is associated with it. And so FDR knew that if he was loved and had pity, those who previously feared him in World War II would no longer fear him. He truly believed that if he was not to be seen in a wheelchair, this same fear that the Nazis had, as well as the Japanese had during World War II, would remain constant. But if he were to be seen in a wheelchair, this pity and this love would outweigh the fear they once had. Yes?
How do you know that Franklin Delano Roosevelt's main concern of being seen in a wheelchair would be led to fear? How do you know that it wasn't led by another position that he had?
Well, I read FDR's biography a couple years ago, and in it he clearly states that he was afraid that those who once feared him would then have pity on him and not have fear anymore. Now, often related to FDR is his fellow cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, who was also President of the United States. And one of the key phrases he had during his presidency was speak softly and carry a big stick. And we can relate speaking softly to almost having some sort of compassion or some sort of love toward those who he was in relation to. Whereas the big stick was essentially a threatening item that could provide harm and cause fear amongst those that were involved. We can see that he, much like his Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that he truly believed that fear as a president was much more effective in times of war and also in times of peace than it was to have some sort of cordial, loving relationship with his people or those that are around him. Another key president in American history that sort of illustrates this point that it's better to be feared than loved is Abraham Lincoln. And now, although when he was elected president, the North, the Unionists, really loved Abraham Lincoln, but it's the fear of the South that really made him a great leader. The South feared that once he was elected president, he would do his best to end slavery, which was one of the main economic gains of the South. The South were truly fearful that once he was elected, he would take away this really economic gain for the South. And so once when he was elected, to incorporate this fear, South Carolina seceded from the Union. This goes to show that they were so fearful of ending slavery, they would leave the United States, they would leave the Union in order to protect what they held dear. And we all know that as the Civil War went on, the Union ended up victorious. And we can see that in the long run, Abraham Lincoln truly did cause a positive change. The fear from the South led to the Civil War. And our third contention, which our second debater will get into, is that this fear oftentimes leads to positive change, and this is clearly seen through the Civil War. Now, into our second contention, which is that love oftentimes can lead to irrational decisions. And to start out this contention, I would like to quote Machiavelli, who wrote this entitled essay called The Prince. And in this, Machiavelli states that a leader who possesses love versus fear is more oftentimes keen to irrational decisions, and oftentimes his followers do not respect it. We can see this that Machiavelli was an enlightened leader in the late 1400s. He truly was a revolutionary thinker, as this was the first time anyone had published any sort of work on how to be a leader. And this is sort of a roadmap for future leaders to see that if you were to be loved by your followers, you more often than not have less control over your followers than if you do if you were feared. An example of this would be Kim Jong-il, who's the leader of North Korea. Yes?
Would you say that control is the main thing that a leader should be worried about in leading whatever nation or group that they're in charge of?
I would say the goal of a leader is to ensure that whatever domain he's leading has some sort of success. And as we've seen in our first contention, that when fear is involved, more often than not, that nation or scope of leadership has success. Now, I was saying about Kim Jong-il. He was the leader of North Korea in the late 60s and early 70s. And now the people of North Korea viewed him as a god. They essentially believed that he was descended from the heavens to lead the chosen people of North Korea to success and to veneration. But from outside looking in, we can see that Kim Jong-il had several atrocities against his people. He would not allow them to see the media of the outside world. He would often starve them. And these great atrocities were not seen from the inside, as these people on the inside truly did love him and revere him, as they thought he was a god. And this love sort of really held back North Korean people. And even today, this fear, this love for the admiration of their leaders really holds them back against the rest of the world. Another leader that loved these irrational decisions was the Emperor of Japan during World War II. And much like Kim Jong-il, the Japanese people believed that this leader of Japan was also descended from the gods. And this often led times to drastic war measures. Kamikaze pilots were very prevalent from the Japanese forces in World War II. And this is because they believed so much, they loved their leader so much, and thought him as a god, they would do anything to serve him and to make him better. Thus, it led to kamikaze attacks, which resulted in Pearl Harbor. This blind love for their leader resulted in several attacks on American warships as well as Allied warships. And this just goes to show how love can be very blinding and lead to irrational decisions. Furthermore, we can see that at the conclusion of World War II, the Allied forces made the Japanese emperor sign the Declaration, or the Japanese Constitution. And in this, the very first clause was that the people of Japan could not view him as a god, as the Allied forces knew that if they viewed him as a god, they would love him blindly, they would revere him blindly, and thusly they would make more irrational decisions later on. To review our three contentions again, our first contention is that many great leaders of our past have been feared. Our second contention is that love oftentimes leads to irrational decisions. And our third contention, which our second theory will go into, is that fear oftentimes can lead to positive change. It is for these reasons we are proud to propose the House statement that says, "This House believes that it is better for a leader to be feared than to be loved." Thank you.
Everyone's ready?
Yes.
Judges ready? Okay, so let's begin. Throughout history, we can look at countless examples of leaders who were feared and leaders who were loved. Time and time again, we have seen how beloved leaders were able to create not only a larger impact, but an impact that created a larger good for the most amount of people. For all of these reasons, and because this is a fact, the opposition stands firmly against the motion. This House believes that it is better for a leader to be feared than to be loved. For clarification in today's debate, we would like to offer the following definitions from Merriam-Webster Dictionary. Fear, an unpleasant, strong emotion caused by the expectation and awareness of danger. Love, strong affection. Better, more attractive, favorable, commendable, or more advantageous or effective. Because the proposition has not offered a definition of better in today's debate, you must prefer our definition. Through this definition, we would like to uphold the value of utilitarianism. Because of the word better, we must look at this motion in the sense of the most good for the most amount of people. Yes?
Couldn't the word better be a subjective term, as I can think something is better than you would think something is better?
Do you have an opposing, if you don't have an opposing definition, you have to prefer mine in today's round. So, we believe this because of the following two contentions. Contention 1, there's a perpetual cycle of fear and oppression, and it leads to a negative outcome for all parties involved. Contention 2, love fosters progression and productivity without stifling human rights. Contention 1, the cycle of oppression and fear. Subpoint A, fear leads to oppression. Historical context is important because it gives observable examples that show fear does not achieve what is best for the most amount of people. For instance, Hitler and the SS were feared, which led to the systematic oppression of German people and the genocide of 6 million Jews. If the followers of Hitler's regime were not so fearing of Hitler, they would have been able to make a stance against this. Yes?
Weren't many of Hitler's followers in love with Mr. Hitler?
Well, you could argue that, but the thing is, most of the love you see is straight through propaganda, because the love that you would be referring to is from the citizens. The citizens did not actually know what was going on. The people who knew what was going on, including the Nazis and that hierarchy that was going on, were so in fear of Hitler that they could not go against him. Because of this excessive amount of fear, no one was able to go against him and to stop this mass genocide that happened, of the Jews. And so, because of this, you see a direct, huge negative impact that comes from fear and the oppression that comes from this fear. Yes?
Didn't the fear of Hitler around the world lead to World War II, which essentially took him out of power?
Yes, but not before 6 million Jews were killed. The argument is that if people had not feared Hitler so much, that he would have been stopped at a much earlier time. Okay, so then we see Chairman Mao was extremely feared after the Tiananmen Square and the threat of violence against student protesters. Protesters were shut down before they could do anything to positively impact the status quo. Because of this, you can see that the fear directly oppressed the people and directly led to a negative impact. Things were unable to be changed because of this fear and because of this oppression. Things were unable to be changed for the better. Once again, better in our motion today. Subpoint B, oppression leads to fear. Che Guevara oppressed Cuban people through shooting squads in order to foster obedience. While these shooting squads and the fear that came from this death fostered obedience. The obedience didn't matter because it was effectively for a negative impact. Yes.
Doesn't fear lead to revolution as well?
It can lead to revolution, but in our examples, you'll see that this revolution is always for a negative impact for the most amount of people, which does not uphold utilitarianism or our definition of better in today's debate. So, and you see in this argument, the loss of life, the extreme loss of life in this instance is such a large impact, and it stops people from being able to create any positive impact because of this oppression that led to fear. Next, you can see in drug lords like El Chapo support organized crime and use threats of violence. El Chapo has a very loyal follower group, but these loyal followers are loyal because they fear El Chapo. They are doing wrong things. They're doing violent crimes. They're hurting people because they fear for their own lives. Yes?
Aren't the followers of El Chapo a huge fan of him as a result of the amount of money that he's able to provide to them as a result of the drugs?
Well, you could say this, but you could also say that they're only, in my opinion, if you were in El Chapo's rank, I don't think you could get out regardless of whether you thought the money was worth the fear or not. But we can argue that later. So you see this in this contention, the cycle of fear and oppression. Fear leads to oppression and oppression leads to fear. In both of these instances, you cannot get anywhere and create anything productive that would ultimately lead to a positive impact for anyone, or most of all, the majority. Contention 2. Love fosters progression and productivity without stifling human rights. Because of beloved leaders, we have seen so many positive impacts. For instance, you can cite Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He fought for the civil rights movement. He taught nonviolence, tolerance, and civil disobedience. His followers loved him so much, and he was able to create leaps and bounds for the African Americans of our country in the means of segregation and such. So yes.
Would you say the fear of white supremacists sort of led to the outlash of their actions against the civil rights movement?
Sorry, can you repeat?
I said, wouldn't you think the fear from the white supremacists would lead to some of the actions against the civil rights movement?
Well, you could say that the fear led to some of the actions against the civil rights movement, but as we're looking for a positive impact, and I think we can all agree that the lack of segregation is a positive impact, that this fear supporting the segregation and going against the civil rights movement is not something positive in today's debate. Also, so he achieved his goals of seeing black and white children work together after all of this work he did as a non-violent, very beloved leader. Next, you can see Gandhi. He fought to push British influence out of the Indian subcontinent. He did so peacefully. He had nonviolent protests. He was wildly loved by his followers. Everyone loved him. Because of leadership through love, he created an entire sovereign nation. You cannot disagree with the fact that Gandhi, a very loved leader, ended up creating such a positive impact for such a large amount of people. So, to reiterate, the opposition firmly believes that the motion is false. This motion being, this House believes that it is better for a leader to be feared than loved, for the contentions of the perpetual cycle of fear and oppression leads to negative outcome for all parties involved, and the contention that love fosters progression and productivity without stifling human rights. You can see all of this in the positive impacts and our value that we uphold today as utilitarianism. For all of these reasons, I can only see a vote for opposition in today's debate. Thank you.
All right. My friends ready?
Yes, sir.
Are my fellow friends ready? Are my judges ready? Excellent. All right. Well, good afternoon. I'm going to be the second speaker for Team Proposition for the motion, this House believes that it is better for a leader to be feared than to be loved. Our first contention was many great leaders have been feared. Our second contention was that love leads to irrational decisions. And our third contention, which I'm going to go into more detail about, is that fear leads to positive change. After I go into more detail about our third contention, I'm going to address a few of the points that they made in the previous speech. All right. Contention 3, fear leads to positive change. We see that fear goes hand in hand with skepticism. When a person is skeptical of their leaders, they're more likely to be informed about that leader's actions. We oftentimes see this leading to revolution. If we look to the 1700s with the British colonization of the American state, we say that many American colonists feared the British Empire. As a result of this fear, we see that many American revolutionists thought it was time for a revolution. Yes, sir.
So wouldn't you say that fear can also be used to stifle political change, such as our example of Che Guevara and his shooting squads that helped to stifle the change that was going to happen against him in Cuba?
I would say that fear kind of led to Che to eventually do that. So we see that fear often leads to this form of revolution. Continuing on with the American Revolution, we see that they feared King George and his actions and what he could possibly do to these American colonists. So due to this, they created the American government with the Declaration of Independence, and they fought the Revolutionary War, in which they ended up receiving their independence from the British Empire, creating the United States in which we are today. Having this fear creates more skepticism about these leaders. When a person is more skeptical, they are more informed. They are more curious on every single action that leader is eventually going to take. And we find this is often a problem in our American government today. The American people aren't that skeptical of their representatives. As a result of it, they do not stay informed about what their government is doing. Due to this, many people do not vote. If we look to a Florida university study conducted during the 2014 midterm elections, we see that only 35.9% of eligible American citizens voted during that election. This is a complete atrocity. We need more people to vote, as that is the best way for a democratic government to function. When we do not have many people voting, that can lead to the lack of information coming to the American people, leading to these leaders going into oppressing the American people. And this, just having too much love for these representatives and these leaders can just lead to a lack of skepticism of their actions. And skepticism is very important, as we see that without it, the American people are not informed. I also want to bring up the Iranian Revolution. We see that Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was in charge during before the Iranian Revolution, and he was instated by the CIA. Now, many of the Iranian people did not like this leader. He was very authoritarian, he was secular, and he was the Shah of Iran. They did not like this. They wanted a leader that reflected more of their values. And they also feared that they could be executed as a result of any opposition of his power. So as a result, we see that the Iranian Revolution occurred. And with this, we have a new leader instated into Iran, and a new government formed that reflects the ideals of the Iranian people better. Now, I want to go into their points. They mention Hitler and how he used fear, he used fear as a way to control his people. And I actually disagree. Hitler was a democratically elected chancellor of Germany. The people of Germany loved Hitler. They liked his ideals, and they supported him. As a result of this, we saw the atrocities that occurred during World War II and the Holocaust, which were obviously very atrocious. Yes, sir.
Didn't the people in Germany during Hitler's regime weren't they in constant fear of the SS and other secret police that were pretty much like thought police, like Orwellian thought police?
We're talking about the vast majority of Germans here who voted in support of Hitler, and eventually many of them fought with the Nazi regime in World War II. So I would say the vast majority actually loved Hitler. However, we see that many of the people around Germany, including the United Kingdom, the United States, and France, all feared him. And as a result, we see World War II being sparked. They also mention how oppression can lead to fear, and I actually think the contrary is true. We think that without fear, oppression can happen. If there is an unconditional love for a leader, oppression is very easy to occur. It can happen without the acknowledgement of the people. I bring up the American example again. I highly doubt that many Americans today know about the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, which is an act that was passed by Congress last year, which is going to allow companies to share information with the government about about private information that you have shared with that company. Many Americans don't know this, and this is a form of oppression against the American people. So with this unconditional love that we have for our American representatives, we see there is a lack of information to the American people, and they're not informed, and therefore they do not vote and change this government. They also mentioned El Chapo. El Chapo has this group around him that is where he is highly supported, and due to this, it's due to love. They love him because they're able to get a tremendous amount of funds due to this drug money that is highly profitable for El Chapo and his supporters. However, fear is what caused him to eventually be arrested. Fear allowed the Mexican country to become safer, and as a result, the United States and the surrounding Hispanic countries were able to become safer because he was arrested due to this fear. He was a leader, and because of this fear, we saw that he was stopped. Now, they also mentioned Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was obviously a great civil rights leader, and they mentioned how he was loved by his surrounders, and of course loved by me. However, we see what sparked Martin Luther King Jr. to become a leader. And we see that this was started by fear. Many leaders that were in the American government at that time feared many African Americans feared the leaders in the United States at that time and the oppression that could occur. So, as a result, we see Martin Luther King Jr. lead the opposition of this in creating the civil rights movement. Now, I want to go over our contentions one last time before I transition to the next speaker here. Our first contention is that many great leaders have been feared. Our second contention is that love leads to irrational decisions. My third contention is that fear leads to positive change. For the House motion, this House believes that it is better for a leader to be feared than loved, and I encourage you to vote with the proposition in this case. Thank you.
All right. Opposing team ready?
Yes.
Partners ready? And judges ready. First, before we start time, I'd like to give a brief roadmap of what I'm going to be going over in this rebuttal. First, I'm going to address their contentions and give brief reasons of why they are incorrect, and then, if time allows, I'll go back over my own contentions. Now let's begin. First of all, I'd like to reiterate our value of utilitarianism in this debate and how it can be used in order to prove the negative side. We need to prove that through through love, more people are being helped by leaders who are loved rather than feared. Okay, so let's start with their case. So their first contention was that many successful leaders have been feared. Now they brought up a very questionable example with this. They brought up the example of FDR, who they said was feared by the Axis powers in World War II, for example. But I would like to reiterate that FDR was not actually only feared; he was loved by his people. And because of this, it shows that this great leader, FDR, who created such great social programs that allowed, for example, great economic change, emerged because he was loved and not just because he was feared. So we need to interpret both of these sides of the resolution. Next, they brought up the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln as another example. He talked about how the fear of the South was one of the main contributing factors to the actual start of the Civil War and the maintaining of the Union. But I would like to reiterate that this was not the only thing, and it's actually love that was the main motivating factor. The love of the Union soldiers, of their Union, of their leaders, Abraham Lincoln, and such like that, prompted them to fight for the Union and to prompt them to fight for their loved brothers, the people that were in the southern United States. Go ahead.
Was the South not fearful that President Lincoln would take away their economic...
Yes, they were fearful, but I'm saying that the main motivation was their love for him, the Union's love for him, because that's what motivated the Union to fight for him in the first place, and that is the main determinant of why we were able to win back the South in the Civil War. Next, I'd like to address their second contention, that love leads to individual decisions, and then I'd like to say that one of the main things that they brought up in this contention was that control is associated with good and is associated with success. Now this directly clashes with our contention because we value, again, utilitarianism, the benefit for the greatest amount of people, the people's choice, not what some leader has to say. Okay.
I just wanted to clarify that we did not say that control leads to betterment.
Oh, okay. I must have misheard then. But from what I heard, most of their evidence still is supported by that fact, and I will still address that. They brought up the example of North Korea, for example, with Kim Jong-il. They said that his people loved him, and that is the reason why they're being impressed by him. Because they love him so much, they have unconditional love for him. So they don't want to rise up against him. But once again, I'd like to bring up, your information to point your attention to the other examples of dictators that we brought up in the other contentions of oppressive cultures that were much more forceful and used fear as their means of stifling their people. For example, Che Guevara. Yeah.
With the example of North Korea, if the people were fearful of Kim Jong-un, wouldn't it be likely that they would have a revolution?
No. What I was actually about to say, this leads in pretty well to what I was going to say about Che Guevara. North Korean, actually, this love that is created by, this love that is represented in the public is actually created through fear of the leader. For example, there are internment camps that North Koreans that rise up against the government go to. This also relates back to Tiananmen Square and Che Guevara, because things like punishment that create people to fear their leaders, it makes people think and makes them less likely to take aggressive action that could be very risky. So for example, if you're going to start a revolution, you're either going to be killed or you're going to succeed, or put into a prison camp or something like that. So it's very important to see that the fear of being imprisoned or the fear of being put into an internment camp or being killed by a firing squad just for rising up against a government that uses fear to control its people, that is not betterment of the world. That is not betterment of the people that it's serving, for one thing, using utilitarianism once again. I'd like to point out that the greatest good for the people that the leader is serving is what? Okay, go ahead.
If nobody ever feared Hitler, why would there be any move to stop?
Okay, I'm not saying that people didn't fear Hitler, but I'm saying that the main motivating fact of why Hitler was able to be stopped, and if this would have happened sooner, Hitler could have been stopped even sooner, was the fact that he was that he was feared by his people. And so the main thing is the people. So let's go beyond Hitler and look more into Nazi Germany and the institutions that Hitler created, such as the SS and the concentration camps. Once again, fear of concentration camps and fear of being discovered by the SS is very important here, because it shows that your thoughts aren't even your own. I'd like to. Okay, go ahead.
Weren't the German people quite ignorant to the SS and their actions as a result of
No, they weren't. No, the German people were very, very aware of the fact that they could be put into an internment camp for speaking out against government. That's the main reason why they didn't speak out against the government in the first place and foster things like the revolution that our opponents are talking about. So once again, I'd like to talk about that. Also, they brought up that because these people voted for Hitler in the first place, they loved him. Now, Hitler was a charlatan. He was pretty much just a snake that spoke in twisted language to try and manipulate people. Just because they voted for him in the first place does not mean that they loved him throughout his whole regime. People in Germany hated him after they found out who he was and found out what he was capable of and what the Nazis were capable of, putting 6 million Jews in concentration camps and killing them, and trying to expand the German Empire across the entire world. Go ahead.
Once the world and people did realize that he was making these atrocities, they ended up fearing him, and that fear is what led to the Allied intervention of the German people in the Nazi regime.
Okay, I'll address that. I'm sure my partner will address that in the next speech, but once again, I have more important matters to discuss. So next I'd like to address their third contention, which directly clashes with our own case. They said that fear directly leads to positive change. And they brought up the example of Iran and the dictator that was put into power that was strict, although he got things done. I'd like to bring up another example of a dictator within the Middle East, Gaddafi, who used chemical weapons against his people in order to stifle them. He was the only reason why Gaddafi was able to get away with the acts that he did was because people were too afraid to do anything. They were too afraid to speak out against them. Okay, and then I'd like to also point out that this directly clashes with our first contention, that the cycle of oppression and fear is a positive feedback loop that just leads to no progress happening, and therefore by the resolution, fear being bad for progress. Once again, I'd like to reiterate the fact that Che Guevara and Chairman Mao, for example, at Tiananmen Square, the huge demonstrations of power that caused the people to fear being, once again, imprisoned for life or killed for their beliefs, was the main motivating factor that made them too afraid to speak out. And if you look at the famous picture from Tiananmen Square of the one person standing in front of the tank, the college student, did anything really happen because of that, directly because of that? That revolution was directly stamped out because these people were too afraid to act and latch onto this idea of a revolution, just because they were afraid of internment camps and firing squads and the like. So we can see that fear is used to manipulate people. For all these reasons, my partners and I can only see a vote in negation of today's motion. Thank you.
Partners ready?
Yes.
Judges, are you ready? Other friends ready? Well,
Yep.
awesome. Then I shall begin. I am the third speaker for Team Proposition, upholding the fact that it is more important for a leader to be feared than to be loved. I will begin by discussing some of their points and giving a rebuttal, and finally I'll go back and re-summarize our points. So, before I really get going, I want to start by making a clarification that there are two main types of fears that we're talking about here. There's the fear that, oh, I could fall off the stage and break my ankle. That would not be good. And there's also the fear of authority, in that sense, where you have a reverence, you have a respect for authority. And I just want to make a clarification there that there are really two different types of fear, and both are very important regarding leaders. So, whenever you have social change, you're going to see fear as a result of that. We can look that they're talking about Martin Luther King. Well, as he strove for social change, he was feared by the current government, the current Western ideologies, which wanted to suppress that belief that all men really were created equal. They were afraid of the change that could come about as he rose to power and led the civil rights movement. So, in fact, if he were not to be feared, he wouldn't really be making a change at all. And in that sense, fear is very important for a leader to be productive. We can see this as well with Gandhi. Although he was a man of small stature, not physically imposing, he was feared by the British government as they wanted total control of those colonies in India, and he stood against that. Although he had nonviolent protests, they feared the change that could come about as a result of his philosophies of nonviolence and standing up against these colonial powers. So, although it may not have seemed like he was feared, because he was striving for social change, he was feared ultimately by those who resisted it. And that is something that's very important to consider. So looking at their first contention here, perpetual cycle of fear leads to repression and vice versa. Well, I would like to consider that if Hitler were never feared by anybody, who would have done anything to have taken him out of power? The fact that he was feared, the fact that people recognized that what he was doing was terrible, led to action, which essentially took him out of power. And furthermore, they may claim against it, but these leaders were loved. They were loved for the wrong reasons. They were loved because of mass propaganda. And sadly, this love is still love. We see in North Korea as a modern day example that Kim Jong-un is ultimately loved by his people, not because he's a great leader, we can see that he's not, but because we have this propaganda shoved down the throats of the North Korean people, which calls them to believe that their dictator is a god. If he were to be feared, like my partner was saying earlier, that would lead to a rise in skepticism and ultimately, I believe, an uprising in North Korea. However, we have this blind love about this one leader, which is a result of mass propaganda. It is love nonetheless. Let's see see what else is there. Oh yes, so we have this thing, this idea of unconditional regard. This is kind of a psychological thing that comes about as a result of love. When you have a lot of love for a leader, you start to have unconditional regard. And this is the idea that someone has total respect for another person and thus loves them regardless of anything they do. Now this is a dangerous sort of love, and we can again see this in the case of Mao Zedong and Adolf Hitler, where the people, many of them, because of all this propaganda, began to have this unconditional love for their leaders, and as a result, and they didn't have fear of them, they didn't question what they were doing, and it was until several years into Hitler's rise that people began to question what he was doing. They began to fear him, and as a result, we had a war come about, and that led to his downfall. So now that I've looked at some of their points, we're going to go back and look back upon ours. Again, we see that many great leaders have been feared, not only feared in reverence by their own people, but feared out of a trembling sort of fear by the opposition, by the enemy. And if you don't have this sort of respect from your enemies, a lot of bad things can happen. If they question your power, that can lead to invasion and sorts of things of that nature. We can look back to that one Roosevelt quote. It says, "Speak softly, but carry a large stick." So, it is important for our leaders to be feared by the enemy as well as respected by the people, but with a respect that is skeptical and not believing everything that's told to them. Okay, our second contention is that love leads to irrational decisions, and I believe we've covered this pretty well looking at the way that people can fall into this sort of unconditional regard, this mad love, in which they, after having lots of propaganda or having a disillusioned ideal of their leader, they begin to not question what they're doing and instead follow blindly with the actions of their leader. We see this as a modern day example in North Korea and in past examples with Mao Zedong in China and Adolf Hitler in Europe. Finally, we also see that indeed fear does lead to positive change. We can see that if a leader isn't being feared, he probably isn't leading to a whole lot of change. Again, if Martin Luther King weren't being feared by the establishment, trying to repress the civil rights movement, that would probably mean that he wasn't doing a whole lot. And so although this fear led to conflict, it ultimately led to a change, and we can look and see at the society we have today and see that it is indeed a good change. Furthermore, we can see again with the case of Gandhi that if he weren't feared by the colonial British government, he would have most likely not been creating that big of a change. So ultimately, there is both a reverence sort of fear and there is a trembling, oh, I might fall off the stage and break my ankle sort of fear. And both are important for a leader to have, and ultimately more important than love in terms of being shown towards a leader. And it is for these reasons that we uphold the proposition and urge the vote in proposition of this motion.
Judges ready? Opponents ready? Yes. Pardon? All right, let's begin. Judges, now I have a variety of points to go down the flow and run down and systematically pick apart. Most of the points that our opponents have created and established today are mainly contradicting themselves, and I will bring up a counterpoint to every single one of their examples that they have brought up. First of all, I want to bring up the factual error that they, in their first constructive speech, that was due in the case of Star Wars. Now, we all know Star Wars is a very symbolic stature of today's in today's environment, and we see how they misimplemented the use of the Star Wars. Now, I want to bring up a quote The more you tighten your grip, the more star systems will slip from your fingers. Now that's from Princess Leia. That's directly towards Darth Vader when she is directly addressing him about the fear that he is using to implement their empire or their imperialistic state in the universe. So this shows the empire is failing because of the implemented fear that they are trying with the stormtroopers, that they made the Death Star. They had many types of different implementations that were designed to use fear to stifle progressive thoughts and many other cases resistances. Go ahead.
With my Star Wars quote in my first speech, I was referring to the fact that as a leader, Darth Vader was feared and thus he was more effective as a leader.
I understand what your point was, but I just brought up a counter argument that did take off that Star Wars argument. So that takes me into the motion today. The motion reads, this House believes that that it is better for a leader to be feared than loved. Now, our opponents have brought up many cases where a leader is being feared. Now, it is only the opposition's problem today to establish that not only is loved leaders just a symbolic state, but it has to be the same level as feared leaders. I'm sorry if that's a little bit confusing, but I will move later into that. So, for every feared leader that they have brought up in today's debate, there has been a loved leader or a loved characteristic about that leader that counteracts that argument. So if we bring up a counter-argument for every single leader that they have brought up as feared, then we negate the motion because we are not proving that loved leaders are better, but we are proving that today is just basically a stalemate which counteracts the motion itself. So first I want to move in with FDR. I want to start off with FDR. FDR is remembered as one of the most loved leaders in the United States. We remember FDR not as someone we feared, but as someone we loved. He implemented so many social programs that brought the United States out of a Great Depression, that helped many people who were starving, who were dying because of starvation and because of housing. Go ahead.
Wasn't the fear that many nations had against FDR what made him very successful with negotiations with the creation of the United Nations?
That might be true, but what I am saying is the people of the United States loved FDR as well. There may have been fear that was implemented in his own heart. He was afraid of what people would think of him, but the people intentionally loved him. We cannot negate the fact that there might have been some fear in his heart, but we can also prove the fact that there was love that came from the people of the United States. Go ahead.
Wasn't it the fear of FDR from enemies of the United States that kept these loving people safe?
I don't think so. I'm talking directly about the domestic problems in the United States. No, thank you. I want to move into the example that they brought up about Abraham Lincoln. Now, I don't think anybody in this room would remember Abraham Lincoln as a feared leader, a leader that we feared. We remember Abraham Lincoln as the one who enacted the 18th Amendment, the one who started the Emancipation Proclamation, the ones who freed the slaves, the one who majorly destroyed slavery within the United States. Now, we cannot characterize these great leaders as ones that we feared because there were some small characteristics that might have been there. We have to characterize what they are remembered as. We remember them as loved leaders. We see many cases today on how these presidents and how many great leaders we have as loved leaders, not as feared leaders. Go ahead.
We stated that the Confederate station wanted to fear President Lincoln because he would take away the economic concerns of slavery. Did the Union soldiers not love President Abraham Lincoln? What we are seeing here is there for every characteristic that is feared, we see a characteristic that is loved. So we cannot counteract that argument. The motion is standing negated because of the reason that the feared leaders are not better than the ones that are loved. We are seeing a stalemate essentially because there is no way to essentially prove that feared leaders have the same standing as loved. Go ahead. That's what we're saying. We're trying to show that love may be country, but we're saying fear is the most prevalent.
So how does that make feared leaders better than loved leaders? It's legitimately just making the resolution or the motion itself negated. There's no implication that you are showing that feared leaders are better than loved. No, thank you. Now I want to move into the second contention about how truly loved leaders I want to bring up their second contention about how truly loved leaders were only loved because of fear in the first place. Now what we see here is fear is the main stimulating issue of this problem. Go ahead.
All we're saying is that because love is essentially popularity and fear is safety, that fear is better than love.
Thank you. Now I want to move into how truly
truly loved leaders were only loved because of fear. We see Hitler in Nazi Germany. They say that Hitler was maybe loved by some people, but we see this love only implemented because of fake characteristics. Hitler had the SS, the secret police, patrolling Nazi Germany and making sure that no one spoke out against the attritions that he was having against those Jewish people living there. We see North Korea, the internment camps and the propaganda that is released by North Korea about how Kim Jong-un is a god. We see in many cases that the people that we see that are loving these leaders, we only see them loved because there is fear in the first place. The main problems that have come out about from their case is what we're seeing is they bring up examples, but we bring up counterexamples in every single scenario. I have another example from how they brought up in the first case about how we feared King George and how that led to the creation of the United States. Yes, that didn't happen, but we also see that people loved George Washington and the founding fathers that were the ones that led the fight against King George, and that led to the creation of the United States of America. So we see in many cases there might be some people who are characteristically characteristically feared, but we also see in many cases they are loved as well. Go ahead.
We see with George Washington, it's also a great example of blind love in that the people loved him so much afterwards they wanted him to become a king, which was essentially against the fundamentals that they had just gotten rid of.
That is your third contention. I agree with that. But again, that's not the point I'm trying to make. I'm trying to make the point that is one character that you might have brought up. But for every one character you bring up, I bring up 5 characteristics that these leaders' characteristics are loved rather than feared. And what we are seeing today in today's debate is that most of these leaders that we see are feared in some cases, but they are only loved because of the fear that is implemented by the propaganda, by the internment camps in North Korea, by those SS police or the secret police within Nazi Germany. We see in many cases today, as my partner brought up before, how Gaddafi in Libya brought up used chemical weapons against his own citizens, and brought up the fact that how this progression and productive change was stifled by these types of feared leaders. For all these reasons, I can only see negative ballot in today's debate. Thank you.
Okay, judges, are you ready? Friends ready?
Yes.
And friends ready? Yeah. Okay, so first off, I want to bring this debate back to the main voting issues. So first of all, I want to add on to what my partner said in his previous speech about this debate reaching a stalemate. For every example that they brought up of their leaders like FDR, for example, Abraham Lincoln, Kim Jong-il, we all brought counterexamples of how those same exact leaders had the exact opposite characteristics, whether it be fear or love that negated what they stated. So because of this, you can see that directly all of their examples do not still stand, because we can continue this. We can state, for example, how the people loved this leader, but the opponents hated these or feared these people. And we can just continue this all day. And we really need to just get back to the main issues of the debate. So first of all, now I'll continue on to my own contentions to explain how they still stand and our examples are still standing. So first of all, I want to bring up our contention of the cycle of oppression and fear, this positive feedback loop that hampers progress. Now, our opponents haven't really addressed this point. I want to reiterate the point of Chairman Mao and Che Guevara and even Muammar Gaddafi. All of these examples of dictators who are fostering fear among their people and hampering this political change. People cannot contribute to political change if they fear death, if they fear all these things, and it prevents the general public from rising up in revolution against those leaders. So they haven't brought up any examples of how this would be incorrect, and because of this, our contention still stands. And now I'll move on to our second contention, that love generates progress and fosters productivity without violating these human rights. So first of all, I want to bring up back to MLK and Martin Luther King Jr. and Gaddafi. First of all, they brought up the example of how the KKK, the fear of the KKK is what stimulated a lot of colored people to rise up with Martin Luther King Jr. But once again, this is an issue of the leader. In this case, Martin Luther King Jr. He was not feared. The KKK was feared. And this fear of, and then they also brought up the fear of how the KKK actually, and the people, the racists actually feared Martin Luther King's movement, and how that was hampering to progress. And it fostered political change. And the main thing is that this fear was a byproduct of the love that the colored people had for Martin Luther King and the love of the movement that they had. So this also goes along with the point that we had previously about the Union soldiers and soldiers in general, of how, like, for example, World War II, they brought up the reason why we won World War II. We could just as easily say that the reason why we won World War II was because of the patriotism, the love of the country, of these soldiers that fought so bravely for us. So this is, like I said before, a stalemate of just evidence versus evidence. And we have shown to have the superior facts in this situation with MLK. Also, I'll link this on to Gandhi in that contention. Gandhi, similarly, fear by Britain was a direct byproduct of the political change that he was fostering. The love of all the Hindu people to Gandhi and Gandhi's message of love. And this really just shows that love, being a leader being loved, is superior to a leader being feared. But once again, I want to, finally, I want to talk about the wording of the resolution, that this House believes that it's better for a leader to be feared than loved. By negating the resolution, we don't have to prove that it's better for a leader to be loved than feared. All this goes along with the idea of the stalemate, going towards the negative side, because there is a hamper. They have not shown that it's better for a leader to be feared than loved because of all of our counterexamples. And that's time. So for all these reasons, my partners and I can only see a vote in negation in today's motion. Thank you.
All right, are my friends ready? Yeah. Other friends? Judges. That was a lot, my apologies. Ready? All right, awesome. I'm going to be the fourth and final speaker of this debate, and I'm part of Team Proposition for the motion, this House believes that it is better for a leader to be feared than loved. Now, I feel like it's first important to mention that we are not necessarily saying that love is not present. We're just saying fear is more prevalent and more useful as a leader. I really want to address a few of the leaders that they mentioned. They mentioned Mao Zedong and how it was the fear that he supposedly produced that caused the oppression. And however, I feel like it's the love. The people of China really love Mao Zedong, likely due to the lack of their knowledge of the oppression that he did. So if they were knowledgeable about the oppression that he did and feared him, it was likely a revolution would have occurred in China. With Kim Jong-il, he is loved, or he was loved. The people of North Korea were not aware of many of these actions, including the internment camps that North Korea currently has. He was loved by the North Korean people, and it allowed him to continue to have his regime. Hitler was loved by his people. They democratically elected him. They supported him during World War II. If the people knew about many of the other opinions of the people of the West or of other countries, they would have likely not supported him. Even with FDR, FDR is likely seen as one of the best leaders in American history. However, the love that many Americans have for him leads to an amount of ignorance when it comes to other actions of his. When people mention FDR, they likely mention many of the social programs they helped create, including Social Security. However, they do not mention some of the illegal actions or slightly illegal actions that he tried to create, including packing the courts of the Supreme Court by trying to get more people in there that would support his agenda, which is highly undemocratic and also highly un-American. I also want to mention Abraham Lincoln. People remember him for trying to, or creating the Civil War, making sure the Union won, and ending slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation. However, they do not mention his suspension of habeas corpus in Maryland, which was another highly illegal action by a great American leader. We do not mention this due to the amount of ignorance that we have for many of these leaders as a result of our love for them. I want to return to our contentions here. Our first contention is that many great leaders have been feared. Many great leaders, including FDR, have been feared by other the Axis powers, and this allowed him to have a great amount of power. And also Theodore Roosevelt was feared by the monopolies, so that he helped break them up, and as a result, it was unlikely that these monopolies would reform during his time in office. Our second contention is that love leads to irrational decisions. As I mentioned previously with the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, North Korea, in other words, the love for the leader Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un nowadays leads to amount of irrational decisions that are occurring within that nation, including the use of internment camps, the elimination of free media, elimination of free speech, etc. And now for our third contention is that fear leads to positive change. We've seen that many times. When a leader is feared, people are willing to change their government. When they are just completely ignorant to the fact of what their government is doing, it's unlikely that change will occur. So it's very important that people fear their leaders. So they're aware of their leaders, they're aware of their actions, and they're aware how to change that. So with that, I encourage a ballot in favor of team proposition for the motion, this House believes that it is better for a leader to be feared than loved. Thank you so much.